Brown.
Thank you all for coming to the Super Spreader event. It's 5 years since the world locked down, and I want to start by doing something the government never did, and ask you for your views on lockdown. So behind me, with the magic of technology, there should be a QR code. Here we go. If you could scan this QR code with any camera phone, you'll be given a poll question asking if any lockdown in the UK was ever justified. We're going to do this before the event and after and see how views have changed. So I'll talk while you get on with that. The UK government COVID inquiry ends its final week this week. Their final hearings are tomorrow. This has been a pretty expensive project. It should cost you, the taxpayer, just short of about £300 million. And don't hold your breath. We're waiting 5 years for a final report to even be published. So it'd be pretty good, right? I would assume. I mean, it's taken quite a long time and a lot of money. So should we look at who they're going to invite to speak for the final day of hearings? We've got an academic assessing the impact of lockdown on the LGBT plus community, and we've got a representative from a migrant rights charity. The lockdown inquiry had one job: to ask whether completely unprecedented decisions about locking down the entire population were justifiable, morally, scientifically, and legally. Instead, Nicola Sturgeon has used the inquiry to try and take Brexit to task. The left have complained about austerity on end, and the panel seemed far more interested in whether Cummings's WhatsApp texts were a bit rude, as opposed to whether depriving the civil liberty of our people was justifiable. The Spectator, we think that you all deserve a bit more than that. So for one night only, we're going to give you a taste of what the inquiry could have been. And this is on special offer for just 1/1,000,000th of the price of the actual inquiry. We've brought 5 experts in their field, people who know the science, know the epidemiology, and covered the COVID as it was happening. People who range from skeptics to supporters of lockdown to make their case to you. I'm going to give them each 5 minutes to speak to you. Then we're going to have a short discussion up here on the stage and move over to you, the audience, to start preparing some questions. Joining us tonight, we have Jonathan Sumption, a historian, author, and barrister, and a man who joined the Supreme Court without even having to serve as a judge. But I think, more impressively than that, a man Alistair Campbell once described as having a brain the size of a planet to make the legal and moral explanation of his views on lockdown. We have Sunetra Gupta, an infectious disease epidemiologist and an expert in the transmission of infectious diseases, including COVID-19. Also a signatory to the Great Barrington Declaration, which argued against lockdown measures. We have Matt Ridley, an award-winning British science writer, author of Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19, and one of the proponents first of the lab leak theory, a theory that was censored at the time and, as you'll remember, is now scientific consensus. Christopher Snowdon, head of lifestyle economics at the IEA, to discuss the social and economic consequences, and Tom Whipple, a science writer and special correspondent at the Times, whose reporting on COVID-19 won him the award of Science Journalist of the Year. So before I welcome the panel, let's see what you all think of lockdowns in the UK. We should have a result. Okay, it's looking pretty sad. We've got no at 67.83% and yes on 32.17%. So let's see how that changes after hearing from my wonderful panel. You can welcome them all to the stage now. First, I'd like to welcome Jonathan Sumption to make the case, to explain the legal and moral grounds for locking down the entire population in an unprecedented way. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
This evening shouldn't really be necessary. The reason why it is that the patent inadequacy of the reports so far produced by the official inquiry at great public expense. Lady Hallett has retraced in minute detail the inadequacies of the decision makers, but has said remarkably little about the inadequacy of their decisions. She takes at face value models like those of Professor Ferguson, based on completely unrealistic assumptions about human behavior, and treats them as accurate statements of fact. She ignores the experience of other places which declined to impose draconian remedies that had been chosen by the UK. She doesn't address the many authoritative studies which show that there is no significant correlation between the severity of non-pharmaceutical interventions and mortality. Lady Hallett accepts that the really serious economic, financial, and sociological consequences of lockdowns are relevant, but she then has almost nothing to say about them. She appears to have approached her task on the footing that it was inherently wrong for government ministers I'm told my mic isn't working. That it was inherently wrong for government ministers not to follow the advice of their scientific advisors, even when they plainly got it wrong, as they did when ministers finally plucked up courage to overrule them on the Omicron variant in December 2021. Now, I'm used to dealing with evidence, and I'm impressed by the evidence that human beings will take sensible and effective precautions to protect themselves against those around them against infection without the need of coercion. I'm impressed by the evidence that it was unnecessary to lock down healthy people under the age of 65 who were at minimal risk of death or serious illness from COVID and could have been treated differently. I'm impressed by the fact that Sweden, which did not lock down, got comparable results to Norway, Denmark, and Finland, and better results than we did. I'm impressed by the evidence that lockdowns have caused a serious increase in non-COVID health problems, notably mental illness and dementia. And I'm impressed by the fact that Lady Hallett has managed to reach her conclusions with only a cursory glance at any of these matters. There is a moral dimension to all of this. I don't believe that liberty is an absolute or overriding value, but I think it's a very high value. We are talking about some of the most basic civil rights. The right not to be confined to a place appointed by the state at the discretion of ministers, the right to go where you please without having to justify yourself to the police, the right to associate freely with other human beings, the right to earn an honest living regardless of whether the state thinks that it is useful or necessary, the right to make your own judgments about the risks of daily life in the light of your own circumstances and those of the people around you, rather than have a minister make these decisions for you. Now, civil rights of this kind are not just a convenience. They are fundamental to the existence of social animals like humans and to our life as a community. They are a basic condition of human creativity. They are necessary for our mental well-being and our happiness, and these are the things that life is about. It takes a great deal more to justify curtailing these rights than anything that one can find in the government's thinking at the time or Lady Hallett's reports subsequently. Disease, like crime, external enemies, and economic misfortune are unfortunately risks inseparable from life. Human beings have lived with epidemic diseases since the origin of mankind. The basic question posed by the COVID lockdowns is whose responsibility should it be to limit the ordinary risks inseparable from social existence? Should it be our responsibility or the responsibility of the state? We all have a personal responsibility to look after our own safety. We all have a personal responsibility to limit, as far as we can, the risks which the ordinary incidents of daily life pose to our neighbours. Liberty and safety, however, are only in conflict if we try to shuffle off these personal responsibilities to the state, because the state has only one possible response, namely coercion. And if we make the state responsible for ensuring that nothing goes wrong, then it will restrict our liberty so as to make sure that nothing ever does go wrong. And because the risk of things going wrong is inseparable from life itself, that will almost always mean suppressing a large part of life itself.
Now, lockdown was not the sole driver of the decline in spread of COVID. Cases were already slowing in many areas before lockdown. To discuss the epidemiological aspects of lockdown is Sunetra Gupta. Sunetra, the floor is yours.
Right, does my mic work?
Charlie, does the mic work?
Yes? Yes, it does work. Okay, wonderful. All right, so I've been tasked with answering the question of whether lockdowns did anything to stop the spread of COVID. Now, I have some slides. Where are they? Oh, look, there they are. Okay, so to answer this question, we need to understand what would have happened in the absence of any intervention. So we're talking about, did interventions work? Well, first of all, let's try and understand what happens in the absence of intervention. So I'm going to try and gallop through basically my entire lecture course in first, second years. But here we go. So essentially, we're looking at a system where people go from being susceptible to being infected and then recovering and being immune, becoming immune. And when an infected individual arrives in a totally susceptible population, so that red person coming to the population of people who are susceptible, they will spread the infection and then themselves become immune. And then the newly infected people spread it on to others, and they themselves also become immune. So basically what you see, if this is going to work, is it going to work? Oh dear. Okay, oh, there we go. So what you see, and shown in the red there, is a growth, initially a growth in numbers infected, but that growth slows down as the numbers immune build up, because there are fewer and fewer susceptibles that can be infected. And eventually, so that in the blue you see the numbers, the proportion immune going up. Eventually we reach a threshold known as the herd immunity threshold, where the population immune is too high for the infection to continue to grow, and it starts then to diminish and eventually to die out. With any coronavirus, you need to throw in two other ingredients, which is, first of all, that there is a rapid loss of immunity, and also that transmissibility, like many pathogens, other respiratory pathogens, is seasonal, so higher in the winter and lower in the summer. And that's reflected here in the fluctuations in the herd immunity threshold in that graph. Now, once you put these in the mix, let's see if this will now work. Okay, there we go. Once you put these into the mix, you start to see further waves of infection. And these will eventually settle into a stable pattern, what we call an endemic equilibrium, where the proportion immune oscillates around the herd immunity threshold, and you get these regular winter peaks in infection. Now, this very simple framework can actually explain pretty much every single pattern of spread that we have observed worldwide. If the virus arrives early, in the high season, when, for example, in the winter, this is not really, There we go. So if the virus arrives in a high season, when it's able to spread very quickly, you see a large initial peak, as we did, for example, in New York City, shown over there on the right, followed by smaller peaks. Whereas if it arrives in low season, as it did in Arizona, you'll see a small initial peak, but a bigger peak in the winter. So why am I giving you this lesson in basic epidemiology? The bottom line here is that when infections are declining, you cannot tell whether it's due to natural processes, like I've just shown you here, the buildup of herd immunity, seasonality, or because of interventions that have been put in place or indeed voluntarily adopted. So how then can you tell whether lockdowns slowed the spread of COVID? Well, one way to do that would be, of course, to observe what happens when you lift lockdown. If lockdowns have been doing all the work to keep infections down, then when you lift it, you should get a big exit wave, which is what the modelers predicted would happen in July 2021, when we lifted lockdown. And as you know, that didn't really happen. Another way is to compare outcomes between areas with different levels of stringency of lockdown. Jonathan's already mentioned that a number of studies have done that, and the results are, shall we say, somewhat equivocal. One other thing that can be done, which I was really pushing for 6 years ago, is to try and measure levels of immunity that have already accrued in the population. In our lab, we very quickly developed an assay that could detect neutralizing antibodies to SARS-CoV-2. And when we applied the samples from blood donors in Scotland, which you can see there on the far right, we actually saw only modest levels of positivity by the end of April 2020, although it had climbed to 11% in Glasgow. However, there are several studies which suggest there were high levels of exposure in places like London, New York, I've just shown you, Mumbai, during that first wave. People who cling to the notion that lockdowns work will tell you that only 6% of the UK had been exposed to COVID by September 2020. But these studies are flawed for a number of reasons, not least that antibody levels decline quite sharply with time. If you look across Europe, shown in that bottom bar there, you can see that countries that were hardest hit in the first wave then suffered smaller subsequent waves, whereas those which had very low levels of excess deaths in the first wave got hit quite hard in the second or third wave. And that is a strong indication that herd immunity is playing an important role. So, just to sum up, what we were least certain about at the start of the pandemic, was whether lockdowns could stop the spread, and the data now largely indicate that they played a fairly minor role. By contrast, what we were most certain about is that lockdowns would cause extreme long-term damage. In this context, what we should have done is exploited another feature of this epidemiological system, which is that COVID fatality is restricted to a well-defined class of vulnerable people, vulnerable because of their age and also because of other comorbidities. What we should have put in place is a state-supported system of individual risk reduction for those who are vulnerable. That's what we should have done earlier, rather than locking down faster and harder. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sunetra. Open discussion about the lab leak theory was often stifled or censored entirely by social media companies. Matt Ridley is here to speak to us about the scientific debate and transparency in the UK's COVID response.
Thank you, and can you hear me? I want to pose 3 questions that I think the inquiry should have asked and hasn't. Number 1, where did the virus come from? Michael Gove tried to raise that at the inquiry, and he was immediately shut down by the lawyer for the inquiry. No, that's not the topic of our inquiry. But it's vitally important. Why? Because if this virus came out of a laboratory, that might explain why lockdowns didn't work. Why? because if it's come out of a laboratory, it's been trained on human cells for many months, and that's why it's highly infectious in human beings. And that's why it's going to be very difficult to control with non-pharmaceutical interventions. If it's come straight from another animal, it's not going to be very good at infecting human beings. It might be very lethal, but it's not very infectious. That's the normal pattern that you see. So I think it was a vitally important question. And it almost certainly did come out of a laboratory, let's face it, because in exactly the right kind of lab, in exactly the right city, in exactly the right country, in exactly the right year, they were doing exactly the right experiment to put exactly the right sequence into exactly the right part of exactly the right gene, of exactly the right kind of virus at exactly the wrong biosafety level. And yet the whole scientific establishment closed its mind to this possibility. It was censored, it was silenced. I tried to get the Royal Society to debate this question. They told me, no, we don't like to debate non-scientific questions. Well, I don't know what on earth it is. I tried to get the Academy of Medical Sciences, of which I'm a fellow, and they said it's too controversial an issue. I thought that's what debates were for, was controversial issues. Nature magazine, the Wellcome Trust, I don't think a single grant was given in this country to scientists to investigate the origin of this pandemic. 25 million people dead. That's roughly 1,000 times as many as the Bhopal chemical accident, or 10,000 times as many as a normal plane crash. In all of those cases, we try to find out why so that it doesn't happen again. And yet there was very little interest in that. Second question, why was modeling such a failure? Before the epidemic, there was actually quite a live debate between epidemiologists and modelers about whether or not mathematical models were useful in predicting the course of pandemics. There were some on one side, some on the other. And when it happened, we immediately threw that debate aside and said, we're going to trust the modelers, we're going to talk to Neil Ferguson, we're going to have SAGE, we're going to believe his models. And what happened? Well, in October 2020, we were told there were going to be 4,000 deaths a day in the coming weeks. There was nothing like that. But as Jonathan has already mentioned, in December 2021, we had a really good test of how good modelers were. Because SAGE told the government, if you don't lock down, there are going to be between 600 and 6,000 deaths per day by the middle of January 22, which is a weirdly wide range, by the way. You know, it doesn't really tell you very much, that gigantic range. And for once, the government called the bluff of SAGE and did not lock down, against the advice of Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance. And the result was less than 200 deaths per day at the peak, well below the bottom of the range of the model predictions. And you know, the models gave Sweden a terrible forecast. They said it was going to be a catastrophe. The point is not that Sweden necessarily did perfectly, but that they said it would be a catastrophe. They said it would be a disaster, and it wasn't. So I would argue that the models did about as well as if the modelers were indulging in haruspicy. Do you know what haruspicy is? It's forecasting the future by looking at the entrails of chickens. The third question that I'd like the inquiry to have answered is, why were wildly wrong claims made about vaccines? I think this matters desperately because I'm pro-vaccines. I think they're a very good thing. And I think we've badly damaged their reputation in the pandemic, but not because of the rise of anti-vaxxers so much as because of over-claiming for vaccines. We were told that they would stop transmission of the virus, and they didn't. We were told that vaccine passports would be a good idea, even though the only justification for that policy is because they stop transmission, which they don't. And we actually brought into law in this country that you would have to had to prove that you'd had a vaccine to get access to certain services and certain products and to fly on planes and things like that. And then we were told very clearly that children would not be forced to take the vaccine, and then they reneged on that promise. And they started pushing the vaccine lower and lower down the age range when children were at minimal risk. So when scientists say today that they're very worried about the number of people who will not take the measles vaccine, I think they need to look in the mirror for the cause of that. And I think that's a great pity. So those are some of the ways in which science went wrong in the pandemic. Now, I'm not here to say science did everything wrong. There were some brilliant scientific things done in the pandemic, but the importance of an inquiry is that you look at the things that went wrong.
Thank you so much. Now, lockdowns aren't just a question of epidemiology. They have serious social and economic effects. Our hospitality industry is still suffering thanks to decisions made about lockdown 5 years ago. Christopher Snowdon is here to talk to us about that now.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yes, excellent. So yeah, the economic costs of the pandemic were enormous. In 2020, we saw the biggest drop in GDP since the Great Frost of 1709. During the first lockdown, GDP fell by 20%. And throughout the whole COVID period, the economy was artificially kept afloat through government grants, loans, furlough, and such like. This was done because, as a result of the Bank of England creating £450 billion through quantitative easing, nearly all of which was borrowed by the government and then given to businesses and individuals or spent on things like the vaccine rollout and test and trace. The effect of printing all this money, quite predictably, was to produce within a year or two double-digit inflation. Excuse me. And so a large part of the cost of living crisis we've been living through should therefore be counted as a cost of government policy during the pandemic, as should the increased cost of at least some of the government borrowing, which went up because higher inflation leads to higher interest rates and because there was more debt to pay just because we borrowed more money during COVID. That cost is around £100 billion a year and is ongoing. Now, these are obviously huge costs to set against whatever benefits they paid for. The benefits are much harder to calculate because most of them are intangible, things like lost years of life, and you have to make all sorts of assumptions about what would have happened in the absence of lockdowns that clearly not everybody agrees on. But let's have a go. At the start of the pandemic, as already mentioned, Neil Ferguson famously said that there could be 500,000 deaths in total. Now, while some people greeted that with incredulity, and I agree with Matt's comments about some of the later modelling, that was simply an estimate of what would happen if a disease with a 1% fatality rate infects a large majority of an unvaccinated population of 70 million. It was really just maths, and the maths checked out in the first wave, where we saw around 5% of the population get COVID and 37,000 people die from it. That, of course, left 95% of the population still vulnerable to catching it at a time when there was no vaccine. So, if 60% of the population had been infected in 2020 and they had died at the same rate, there would have been around 450,000 deaths. To monetize that, if you use the Department of Health's figure of £70,000 a year being the value of a quality-adjusted life year, we know that the average age of somebody dying from COVID was 80 and underlying health conditions were very common. Nevertheless, the average person who did die from COVID lost about 10 years of life. Now, you can run these numbers with as many different assumptions as you like, but I don't see any plausible scenario in which the monetized value of those lives saved comes close to the financial cost just to the government, let alone to the rest of society. But that does come with two major caveats. Firstly, we do not know what the human cost, monetize it as you like, would have been had the health service been completely overwhelmed by COVID, which of course was the original plan of the government to stop that happening, and which could easily have happened with a disease that hospitalizes 4% of the people who get it in a country which has pathetically few intensive care beds and is a very labor-intensive disease to treat. Now, the argument from some anti-lockdown fundamentalists is that that would never have happened. The NHS would never have been overwhelmed because people would have acted sensibly and essentially locked themselves down before each wave got out of control. And as evidence of this, they cite the first lockdown, actually, saying that the rate of infection was already beginning to dip before that lockdown began. And that is true. It's something actually Chris Whitty acknowledged 5 years ago. It's no great secret, even though it was in the papers again recently. But that lockdown began on the 24th of March 2020, 8 days after Boris Johnson had told everyone to stop non-essential contact and travel, 4 days after the schools had been closed, and 3 days after the pubs, clubs, restaurants, gyms, theatres, and many other businesses had been closed. And so if the argument is that the government didn't need to do more than that to get the infection down, fair enough, you might have a point. But the economic damage would have been nearly as great as from a full lockdown. You have to remember that most of those businesses that were closed in that and the other lockdowns were really no longer profitable by the time the lockdown began, and they were not going to be profitable for more than a year, no matter what happened. So long as the virus was a threat, a lot of people were going to stay away from home. Therefore, you cannot pin all the economic damage done during the pandemic on the lockdowns. Either people would have voluntarily stayed at home, as some people say, in which case the economic damage would have been roughly similar to what we saw, or they would have carried on as normal, which is more along my way of thinking, in which case hundreds of thousands of people would have died. You cannot have it both ways. With or without lockdowns, a lot of businesses were going to go bust or need various handouts from the government. And that point changes the whole economic equation, because it means that the cost of lockdowns per se was less than what was actually spent by the government, probably much less. Whether that makes lockdowns cost effective is another question, and that depends on a whole bunch of counterfactuals that we're probably not going to agree on. My own hunch is that lockdowns, as we did them in the UK, probably were not cost effective. But the point is, and the point that should not be overlooked, is that pandemics are really expensive no matter how you tackle them.
I'll do that in a sec. We can forget 5 years on, UK decision makers were constantly making decisions about policy with huge gaps in the data. And here to talk about scientific uncertainty and decision making in the pandemic is Tom Whipple. Tom, thank you.
Good evening. I, like many of you, I believe, and many on the panel, am extremely disappointed in the inquiry so far. I had assumed and hoped that it would have adjudicated all of my high-stakes Twitter arguments from spring 2020 and confirmed that I was indeed right about everything. I think we can all hope that Module 4 will come to some of mine and Chris's arguments on Twitter. So I'm going to win the arguments now. I'm going to tell you my fantasy pandemic. What do I think we should have done? Okay, so first wave, I think we should have shifted things 2 weeks earlier. On March the 2nd, Boris gives the speech he gave on the 16th of March, which, by the way, the Times wrote up as Britain in lockdown, but was mainly about voluntary measures. It was only over the next week, as Chris said, that in a panic, the compulsory ones came in. But in my fantasy pandemic, they're not needed. By going early, by being bold, we did a Sweden, and it's still the biggest behavior change in peacetime in history. It is still hugely economically costly, and many thousands still die. But the schools stay open, and we accept the trade-off because the trade-off is worth it. Then, in my fantasy pandemic, in November, we don't do a Sweden. We lock down earlier and more sensibly. Vaccines are on their way. Every infection saved is worth it. The lockdown is shorter, and in this thing which, alas, runs round in my head because I've written more words about COVID than Tolstoy wrote about war and peace, we win. Now, this is my fantasy pandemic. It might well be your nightmare pandemic, but what unites all of our fantasy pandemics is they are pointless. They are a parlor game. Firstly, they're pointless because they are unprovable counterfactuals. I can make these assertions and believe these assertions, and they can be different to your assertions, and we will never resolve it. The more important reason why they're pointless is because they really, in a large extent, don't matter. Maybe with perfect knowledge, we can perfectly retrofit the perfect response to a virus we now sort of perfectly understand. That will never come again. The next virus will be different. It will spread faster or slower, it will kill more or fewer, it will kill different age groups. The young say, if we finish our alternative COVID inquiry saying lockdowns are never justifiable, well, what happens if flu comes along? Kills kids, as flu does, and we've got a vaccine because we've got one for flus. We just have to wait 6 weeks, and then you can start rolling it out. Or, what if we decide that there's always the right response, and when a deadlier virus comes along that actually we could have just controlled with a bit of work from home, we decide we must lock down. Now, I'm going to say something that's quite trite, which is the only thing that matters is, were the decisions right at the time? But actually, this is really worth thinking about when you consider the range of uncertainties they had at the time. And the one I want to talk about, which actually I don't think they did consider at the time, and we never consider now, is what would have happened if the vaccines hadn't come along. In April 2020, I spoke to Kate Bingham, Saint Kate Bingham nowadays. She got a lot of flack between the sort of then and the sainthood. And she told me something fascinating. She said, quite cheerfully, she'd been in biotech for a long time, she said she thought she'd fail. She thought, we're not going to do this. We've never made a vaccine this fast. We've never made one against this kind of virus. And actually, most vaccines fail. So then what would be our pandemic post-mortem here? Well, some of you really wouldn't be here. All of us would have had to get it. We wouldn't have, 60% was nonsense because it doesn't neutralize, so everyone would have got it. The story of the pandemic would be, how do we make 700,000 people die in the most orderly fashion possible? It would have been, how do we ensure that there aren't too many tents in the hospital car parks? Now, I don't have the answer to what the correct decisions would have been with the probabilistic assumption that we wouldn't have got a vaccine. But you can see how it turns the whole thing on its head. So look, I know what people want from the inquiry. They want the jokey, they want the answer. They want the adjudication. They wanted to say we should have done X, Y, Z, then everything would have been fine. It can't do that. And to the extent that it has done, particularly with sort of how many lives it said should have been saved in the first wave, I think it shouldn't have tried. My goals, what I would like to see from the inquiry is less ambitious, and actually, look, I've read far too much of the inquiry, and it gets summarized in sentences when we're talking about thousands and thousands of documents. But what I would like is, I'd like to have spent longer on the rest of the pandemic. There's something really weird about focusing on the first wave when we knew the least, when actually the second wave is far more important, and the autumn, when we knew more and just faffed around in all sorts of ways, is a lot more important. I'd like a more sophisticated talk about lockdown. We've made it a political binary. This is our tribe thing. I mean, let's be honest, this is the Spectator. A lot of people have their particular tribe. This is our signifier, just as masks were a shibboleth in the pandemic. But, there isn't a lockdown. There's a range of measures. And lockdown is a thing that lasts for a set period of time. Could we have had shorter lockdowns? Did they really have to be that long? Then there's the esoteric things. Could we have got lateral flows off the ground faster? One of the more interesting nuggets in the middle of the inquiry is Cummings saying that bureaucracy stopped them getting lateral flows out. Now, they were, as a medical diagnostic tool, they weren't great, but as a really rough and ready way of getting infectious people away from the streets, they were really good. What if we'd had those in the summer of 2020, as Cummings thought? And then I'd actually like to talk about other countries, but not just Sweden, South Korea. We never talk about South Korea. How did they get away without doing any lockdowns? Mainly, though, I have a really different and quite niche recommendation. I would love it if we had tested more. Not in the testing for COVID sense, but in the testing policy sense. The things we argue about, actually, aren't the things we know about, they're the things we don't know about. That's why we're here arguing about lockdown. That's why we argued so much about masks. Utterly criminal that we only ran two randomized control trials on masks, and neither of them were very good, but everyone wore them. Schools. I remember schools, the debate about schools in the spring of 2020. Fair enough. You close in a panic, and actually probably we had to close because people weren't sending their kids and the teachers weren't turning up. But what if we'd had a Prime Minister we had more confidence in, and they said, you know what, we might have to do this again. We're going to reopen the schools, but staggered, randomly, 1 week apart, so that some of them opened a week earlier and some of them opened a week later. Then we would have gone into the winter with more data. We were really good at testing drugs, not good at testing policy. So next time around, I genuinely don't have a clue what we should do next time. I do think we should test it, because I think that knowing more is better than knowing less. But broadly speaking, I don't think the inquiry will help. We are humans, we are in our trenches. This has become dogmatic and political. I don't think minds will change. I'll be flabbergasted if those figures on the screen change on the way out to any significant degree. I think probably, for all of the stuff it has found out, and it really has, if you dig into the documents, there's loads of interesting stuff for historians in 100 years there. The inquiry, I think, is quite probably pointless. I think this event's probably pointless because I don't think we'll change minds. I think next pandemic there will be more ideology, not less, unless we're all dead by then. And I think we're probably doomed.
It's always good to end a positive note. Not only are we all doomed, but this whole event is pointless. You heard it here first. So I want to do a sort of brief audience discussion and then bring in the audience, a brief panel discussion and then bring in the audience. So do start to think of any questions. But I think one of the things we have to get out of the way is Matt and Tom. There seems to be a small amount of consensus, but a significant disagreement on the role of modelling. You obviously think that, you might as well be divinating with sheep intestines, and you seem to recognise that it's flawed, but think we should use it. So I'm wondering if I can hear a bit more about that. If modelling is flawed, is it really better than nothing? Is it better than, the plans we had for the pandemic before we started modelling?
So I'll try to talk briefly. I've got lots I could say. I don't think we use modelling that much in actual decision making, and I think the proof of that is what we actually did. If we had, particularly later on, in that January wave, if we had locked down in November, as I suggested in my talk, then you could say, well, that's the result of following modelling. If, however, we waited until the point where we knew we'd baked in 10 days of 1,000 COVID deaths a day, and that was the reason we locked down, well, that's not because of the modelling. The modellers, I think, were hit unawares slightly, because normally when you model a disease, people don't know about your model and aren't following the disease. And obviously people did moderate their behavior. I'll say two things very briefly. First of all, it's fascinating hearing what history has become. I was there in the infamous Ferguson press conference. I'll say he was one of many modelers. It was just the one that spoke first. He didn't say that 500,000 people will die, and you can see it in the report. He said they wouldn't. He said there'd be behavioural change. The usefulness of the modelling, I think, is another question. There was a period when the Spectator had these great graphs that showed what the models were going to do and what actually happened, and you just see this line going along the bottom. But the interesting thing is I spoke to the modellers at the beginning of that and said, do you really think they're going to do that? And they said, oh no, that's like absolute worst case scenario. That's like Leicester winning the Premier League sort of levels of thing. So what they were telling, they had this thing that was infuriating. They said, these aren't predictions, they're scenarios. And it's very hard to pass that. But I don't think they had the outsize impact that people thought. And I could say a lot more because I also feel there were unfairnesses towards them, but I think that's more than enough.
We didn't follow modelling that much. What do you say to that?
There's a very good book called The Herd by Johan Anderberg about the Swedish experience, which is a sort of blow-by-blow account of Anders Tegnell and the other Swedes. And the degree to which they had a sort of visceral dislike of the Imperial College team before any of this began, because they didn't like the way they had been trying to make too precise mathematical prognoses of what happens in pandemics, and I'm sure Sunetra can fill in some details on that. And therefore, their complete horror when Britain suddenly did a volte-face on the basis of what seemed to be one model. And I take Tom's point, there were other people making things. And of course, you know, there were subtleties here that were just missing from it. The models assumed a homogeneous population, that everybody would encounter the same number of people every day. And that's just not the way the world works. The people with lots of contact are going to get the virus quicker and give it to people quicker, and then the other people are going to get it slower. So you're going to see patterns and networks and changing rates, which I think is very much what Sunetra talks about. And it just, back to this worst case scenario point, there was a very odd exchange between Fraser Nelson, the editor of The Spectator, and one of the modelers on what's his name?
Graham Medley.
Graham Medley, thank you. In December 2020, when it was by then pretty obvious that Omicron was much less virulent, that it wasn't just whether you'd been vaccinated that was saving your life, it was also that this strain of the virus was less likely to kill you, but was more infectious. And he said to Graham Medley, but why don't you put that assumption into your model? Because what would be the point of that, was the answer. Because we want to know the worst case scenario. We're not interested in realistic scenarios. That kind of thing, I'm afraid, did go on, and it does need to be called out.
Sunetra, I think there are two questions we have to answer today, and that any inquiry should answer. There's the first, which we've asked all of you, which is, were the lockdowns the right decision? Were they justifiable? There's a second, which is, with the sort of incomplete and flawed data at the time, was it reasonable to think that lockdown was a good approach? And you obviously explained to us how, you know, cases were starting to slow down before lockdown, and lockdown might not have actually contained things. Do you think it was feasible, we're talking about modelling now, do you think it was feasible for modellers to know that with the data we had 5 years ago?
My whole point about modelling, which echoes what Matt's just said, is that models are fantastic conceptual tools. They are absolutely useless at predicting what's going to happen. That is exactly, you may as well read entrails. What was happening there was, and I'd actually flashed up an article I wrote in 2020 about this whole problem. Mathematical modelers have gotten to the habit of using mathematics to convey certainty that isn't there, and effectively are acting like soothsayers. So what I tried to do at that point was to say that you cannot get there's enormous uncertainty. There's nothing wrong with Neil's model. It's just that he took this model and he fit it to some data from the Diamond Princess and a few other bits and pieces of data from Wuhan, and they use this Bayesian statistical technique, and they start to believe that's the truth. But it isn't. Any model would fit. I mean, a number of scenarios would have fit the data. So what we have there is huge uncertainty, which can only be resolved by trying to figure out how many people had already been exposed to the virus, which Christopher Snowdon clearly said he still believes to be about 5%, which is patently incorrect. But what the bottom line here is that we have huge uncertainty. We can keep arguing about this sort of stuff, but it will always, the uncertainty is what matters here. So what do we do in the face of uncertainty? You come up with a policy that is robust to uncertainty. And this idea of focused protection, of state-supported individual risk reduction among those who are vulnerable is a policy that is robust to uncertainty. Relying on modelers to tell you what's going to happen, what's the worst-case scenario, is not a sensible way to go about things. And furthermore, as I said, given that uncertainty, that had to be balanced against the certainty, and it was a certainty, that lockdowns would cause harm. What's the correct implementation of the precautionary principle in that situation? You don't do what you know is certain to cause harm, because there might be a possibility that lockdowns would stop the spread. I think there are a lot of questions that are still unanswered. I don't think one should reject lockdowns wholesale. Lockdowns may possibly be applied with surgical precision in certain situations, maybe, provided other compensations are made for the enormous harm that they cause. But the important thing to recognize is that they are very costly measures and should only be employed under circumstances where there is, where we have absolute certainty that the balance is there, that there's enough benefit to balance the huge harms that they cause.
Can I just add one thing about the Great Barrington Declaration? When Sunetra and Jay Bhattacharya and one other, I can't remember, Martin Kulldorff, came up with the Great Barrington Declaration, there was a furious reaction from within the public health establishment, particularly in the US. And we've seen some emails. How do we stamp out this dangerous conspiracy theory or something? I can't remember, vicious language about you guys. And it got so far, it went so far that Google and others were told to, or decided to suppress it. So you couldn't even look it up. You couldn't even find the Great Barrington Declaration, because if you Googled Great Barrington Declaration, you got criticisms of it coming up in your timeline. Now, whether or not you were right or wrong, that is shocking in terms of, as you've just described, you had a perfectly valid hypothesis that might or might not have been right about how to deal with it. But the idea that we were censoring a debate on this is, for me, one of the shocking things that we mustn't forget.
It's another thing the Royal Society is refusing to, or doesn't feel necessary to debate.
I think that brings us to the question of liberty more broadly in the lockdown. I mean, lockdown was a very authoritarian time. Obviously, we couldn't leave our homes, but also social media companies were deleting posts, Google was controlling search results. There was a desire to push one narrative. Jonathan, Tom posited in his speech, what if this was the flu? What if next pandemic is much, much more lethal? You talked about liberty being a high value. How do you manage that trade-off in the future?
Do it as a sort of mathematical process. He said, if I heard him rightly, that it was useless for the inquiry to say whether lockdowns were a good thing, full stop, because we don't know what the next pandemic will be like. But I don't agree with the statement that the most important thing was to say whether in the light of the circumstances at the time when the government made these decisions, this was the right thing to do. That's all past history. What we need to know now is some guidance, and it can only be some guidance, about what to do next time. It would have been extremely helpful if the inquiry had told us whether lockdowns actually worked in epidemiological terms, and if they did, whether they were worth the considerable collateral costs. Now, I quite accept the point that the next pandemic may be different, but that would at least have been a very good starting point for working out what to do next time, because some of the problems that the government encountered were due to precisely the kind of logical errors that have been pointed out by other speakers. And it seems to me that the least we can do next time is to avoid those logical errors.
I hope you're enjoying the Alternative COVID inquiry. If you want to continue watching, you have to be a Spectator subscriber. If you're still not signed up, fear not. You can subscribe in seconds and get 3 months for £3. Head to spectator.com/live and don't miss another moment.